meditation rapshishila kenya shugwatala chachalo. Aya. Ani taka. Ode tak gortis lamoche. Simje tamje gitando. Simje tamje gitando trutum bege. Tuen konse yunde kunde. Di kibuchi. Sanje je komanchi ne je tobarcha. Teche do. Sanje je koman topje je chu. Jambata nye je chanju ki sim yanda ba tawala soba tambe. Ane. Kishu yu samsa. Chu nyen gi yin samsa. Chu nyen ne. Tabata samba komba chu yin sam kulon. Setam ne sambar shuos.
So at the beginning, we should think that we want to be able to work for the benefit of all sentient beings. But in order to do that, we need to attain the state, become a being, a Buddha, who has removed all faults and developed all good qualities in order to be able to actually affect the welfare of other sentient beings. So we should think that we are going to engage in this Dharma, listen to these teachings regarding compassion and love, bodhicitta, the correct view, and not only are we going to listen to the teachings, but then reflect on them, meditate on them. And in this way, we should set such a motivation for listening to the teachings.
Oh, Chambe Lembas. Teni Ninji Combe Chus, Chamba Combe Chus, Shiora, or Tinane, Tangim Gokote, Chessoin, or Yatis.
No. Anybody carrera?
Oh.
You were the carrera, Chambe Chilian.
Oh, Tambuda Tangim de Shitu Basira, Nibatella Chambe Lembas, Chambe Lembas. And then you come back and bass, what in it under Nyawa Ida, Tandru Soso combat, a chill combat, Niji come back and bass. And they had Chamba come Tuesday. Then she gonna share one. Oh, Tina and that Tambu Chambe Lembas, Niji come back Tuesday, share something better.
So here we are looking at the way of meditating on compassion. And so this is really divided into numerous points. The first of which is developing this kind of foundation of equanimity, of having this sort of equal view toward all sentient beings. And then we have the sort of moistening with love and compassion. That sort of is the second type of stage of meditating on compassion. And then we have this meditation on compassion itself by looking at the various types of sufferings of various beings, from hell beings and hungry ghosts through animals and humans and so forth. And then we get into the way of actually meditating on compassion itself. So here we have this meditation on compassion followed by loving kindness.
Oh yeah, that's on the tongue. Tangum comedian Tambusha Swangando, Seshi, Tandangaran to Tamalia, Chambatan Yingji, Chodich and the Chambatan Yenchi Orwa, Ranga Chambatan Yenchi Ore, Rangina with a Rangi Kawatan Yesa Pamala Soba, Putula Soba Karine Tezule, Chambatan Soa Yorno, the Chodich and the Chambarwa. That's Hama Panyambachi Sores, Tanda Rangi, Niangela Soba Tezule, Chambi Yabanashi. And the same Jack Angarapa, Chibachi, Niji Combat, to the Chibachi Ongura. Oh, Teria Tenica Soda. Somebody sent Yam Gore, Tambutanium de Gores, Niji Champion. Oh, Tini, Tanium Yongo, Kusan Caresana. Simjan Shanda, Simjan Tamje, Soso Sangana, Tawan Dola Tongue Mendova Yambare. Rangi Casa Yesanta to Tawan de Tongue Mendova, in Shanda to the Tawan Mendova Tender Mare Sera. Rana, Ranganamina, Rangan Tamjet Tawan Dola Tongue Mendova Yambare, according to Soso Sigara. And a Rangan Gurneka Konzo Tanda Gazu Sendi Kang Marwa, that church it. Number 2 is Kawangama Tama Toma Kayamara Chimala Tambara. I tell you, Sendi Rangan Yendi, Pama La Soba, Nini Dula Soba, Sazan La Soba, Pubu Dula Soba, Kande in Era. Oh, Tender Majube, Kawangama Namso Tender Majube, Simchi and Omarese. Oh, dear. Rangan China, cutting Chichon Sendi, Pama and Yan this or what Tezulia Zawa Yabanashi, Shandala Zawa Chiba Chaco Udede. Make Tande Pama and Yan Dilla Soba Chamji Yosaki concert to the Nashi, Joangaman also concert Shanda to the Gache or Esa. Says a Rangan Samlatana, Yom Gugre, Samja Rangan Samlatana, Sam Yong Gurete, Churi and Chamba de Rongamares, Jackie Ures, Tishegua.
So we had begun by talking about the meditation or developing equanimity. And so equanimity is like this foundation for developing great compassion, because we all currently have love and compassion, but they're really sort of biased or partial love and compassion just for ourselves and our friends, our family, our side. And so we have to take that kind of sense of closeness that we have towards some and develop that for all sentient beings equally if we are to develop great compassion. And so in order to develop such compassion, we have to begin with this foundation of equanimity. So the reason that we need this is as a basis for our further development. And so one way that we think about this is that all sentient beings are equal in their wanting to have happiness and not wanting to suffer. So just in the way that we and our friends and our family don't want to experience suffering and want to have happiness, so too all sentient beings are equal in that regard. So that's one sort of way of thinking about this. But if we look at it too from our own side, we're not just talking about this life. When we begin to talk about Dharma, we're talking about countless lives. Our previous rebirths are beginningless, and so too are future rebirths. And so when we think about that, we can see that those who have acted as our mother and father, our friends, our family in this life, that's not the only sort of beings that have shown us kindness, but actually in previous lives, there's not a single being who hasn't shown us such kindness. So just like the kind of loving relatives that we have in this life, all sentient beings have acted that way toward us. So there's no way that we can distinguish in terms of kindness that beings have shown us. In this way, we can look and see it's not suitable to just have love and compassion for some and not have that for others, but rather we need to have this kind of equanimity, this a sameness toward all.
Oh yeah. Oh, they in the Kasura. Tande Pamala Soba Ran Kasani Setogi, Ralia Tenepan to whichever nation, Semjan Shen Tamjaki Yankyo Namanamso, Rangitan of Genetic Ralia, Pandoche or Esco. Namjima, Remadon Yamako, Tadige, Tandaram Megas, the paper Rangapama, Yanya Dula Sobachen, Sendi. Yendi Rang Kalaleshila, United Nations Koga, Tamabache or Resura. Oh, Tony is Tare Sepa, Sendi Kanya Shaju, Marta Tande Sendi Rang Cabinus, Paman Yandela Soba, Cabinus, Cariuna, or there's okay, Nikiwangaman of Senate Trache or this. Pass several Tanga Yomar, two several Tanga Yomar. Nianko land is out under so Yendi of Chasoroa. Majundona Yongdua, Pomondao Choki Shibales, Pomoji Sanjay, Shibeke Shigdua, Shibendoles. Nick Keran to Tama, Naji and Pa, Tama Sayores, Kerazuga Nalia said to Mambuche Ores. Nikanga Tinde Sumbachilia, Tanda Mise Naliatini, Shenjachi Yomarese, Tanda Mise Shenjachi Yomaresura. Tato Zuge, so Tanda Yakuchevanes Cheores, near the Zuge, Nema Tadik, Tanda Tadik Chevanes, Laga Tanda Mambucheores. Says I called Jonga Samutana, dear plant over and did never share your mother. Tade so Sentina Shingi, Pambacheva de Samutana, Shandala Tinesha Samutangus, Yam Kore, Sungudwa, or Yam Kobetus and City Sherdwa. Yeah.
So the kind of those beings who are our mother, our father, our relatives, those that we feel close to, those that we like, in previous lives, they may have acted as our enemies. And those that we consider enemies, people that we don't like, those have acted as our kind relatives in the past. So if we look at just this life, that's not really suitable. We need to think about previous lives. So those that we have identified in this life as being our enemy have actually shown us in previous lives the same kind of great kindness that those that we are closest to in this life have shown us. And those that we are close to in this life, those that we consider to be our mother, father, relatives, and so forth, they have also been harmful to us, have been our enemies in previous lives. We can't really even count the number of times that we have, say, killed each other back and forth. There is actually a sutra where a woman posed this sort of question to the Buddha, and we see that he responds that all are really the same in this way. We can't point to one being and say, well, this being has shown me more kindness than harm, because we have had these countless kind of relationships. There's no way that we can point to our relative in this life and say that they have never harmed us, or point to an enemy in this life and say that they have never helped us, because in past lives we have had countless relationships with them. And so in this way, they are all equal. This is one of the reasons that we develop equanimity toward all sentient beings.
Oh, yeah. Tani tani kumdisa ra, tani kumdisa tangbo, rangi tani tsendelia, jawa mengengi chitangi mito solo kumguyarno. Parme simjin sikitwa, rangi kasarabchi, mega sabchi, parme simjin sumbiora. Tende parme simjin tasol randan jawa, yagada tuwa kani jawa mengengi chitangi mito solia, kashelia chawache, kasheli mega chikuya si omara. Korazungune tawandola tunga mido chibade sosungune pasamutana chibade konsulia tandake meni dileka dile mega chikuya yomara kisamutanga doa konsul nyere che yomares ta konsul te sosu te chelia sosu nye sosu kasan yesa pama nyendela soba ta namju jawa yonde sosu nyende yora jesu chikchelia changmalia chibare che tawda mato nang penjulia any chikasure kashel kachita kashel mega tendency yomares what the pazu tawnyum komsa kansa to so sende permanently so what tesuda chikbar is soil tandanga ga ta sa cha pasha mato parmas pasha mato jawmen gere sha mato jawngama jawa yobade de ordo tende sende nyende da chikba parmesim je to so sende da nyende da chikba de samya tini nyamgudwa parma te da susu chende kasan yesanyamdo chikbarachi nyamsona tanyomdachi kashela kodujar kashela yaumare semebaje sidare chitawandola tonge medo chikbare sosa nyamsona siyora ane traduzul samda tradil toz kalekha yorno kendo ta traduzul chibu pasha ke yomare traduzul nyama ranganyen cheba tang mechibare 다시도 타치도 자기가 말해 소소 서버에서 검색하는 잠명게 차그라 예부 차그라 소소 단다 메가서 자신의 소소 사무단 서버고는 앞에 딘베 때문에 메가 차주여 제라도 어디인데 자도서 하다 타치도 자시 봐서 그 말에 건조할 때 한돌 동해면 저 랑경원에 신의 경험만 남서 그 편다고 장 매셔래 계속적고 천지 파마년들에 소보다 시집다고 그랬을 때 냠에 탐시치기도 어디 냠순에는 상마 심지어 탐전 남게 태도 보다 소선 저명게 단답 소선 저 연게 그 삼을 땅게 와라 바람에 심지어 지다 롱베나 바람에 심지어 주세 에테네 소소를 저 요새티체 아니 소소 메가시체 티체 다테네 심지어 상마 남게 태케베 심지어 컨디션에 다wandola tunge medo bachangare rangune ina rala phe tangke changjare yewa che me sa namke thadang yembe semje thamjel semnyam ko gotwa o tijishuna
So here, when we are meditating on equanimity, actually trying to develop this, we start by viewing sort of a neutral person or a stranger, someone that we don't have a particular relationship with. So not a particular closeness or love, not a kind of dislike for that person. So we don't feel a sort of particular closeness or distance. We're not feeling those sort of pulls toward that person. And we begin by thinking that they are just the same as all other sentient beings, in that they want to have happiness and they don't want to suffer. And when we are able to have that kind of realization or that sort of feeling toward those that we don't necessarily feel close with, we don't really have any kind of relationship or any sort of feeling toward them, we begin to think about them in this way. That other than having sort of posited them as a stranger or sort of a neutral person in this life, there's no chance that we haven't had a relationship with them in the past. And they are the same in wanting to have happiness and not wanting to have any kind of suffering. And once we have meditated on that sort of neutral person, we then turn to those that are our friends, our relatives, those that we feel close to. And so again, we think about how other than just the sort of relationship that we have in this life, it's not definite in any sort of a way. And we try to equalize, make the sort of same feeling toward those that are our relatives, those that we feel close to, as those that we really don't have any relationship with. And then we take it a step further, going to those that we dislike, our enemies, which becomes a bit more of a challenge. We have to recognize that it's not any sort of definite enemy that we have there, but rather that's sort of like they're not one-sidedly completely our enemies, but rather just in this life we have designated them as such. But they have definitely been our relatives, our close friends in the past. And so we try again to see these beings as equal, those that are sort of neutral, our relatives, and then those that we dislike, those that are our enemies. And once we have been able to equalize all three of those types of beings, we try to expand out to all sentient beings, recognizing that they all are equal in wanting to have happiness and not wanting to suffer in any way. And they are all equal in terms of having acted kindly towards us in previous lives. So again, we progress, beginning with those that we don't have any sort of relationship with in this life. Then those that we do, those that we feel close to. Finally, to our enemies, and then trying to expand that all out to all sentient beings equal to space, and recognizing both of these components, that they're all equal in wanting to have happiness and not wanting to have suffering, and also that they have acted kindly towards us. They're not sort of one-pointedly our enemies or anything like that, where we should have these feelings of closeness and distance.
Oh yeah, that time you say nyam sa suna, ani chambe chu lemba cha asro sashi re nyam suna tele chu ta ko na shi. Jambe semjetene lemba chako de shara o te condition jambe semjene lemba chasro ni ji sabu tamne sangmal tangyam ji chasona ne yong ge chamba ina da da trendu chamba ina da chamba de chida ni yong go ra yong ge chamba se de de ngan so sangme ma che ba chi ba re chi je se du sam ma she se ro de zun do de do ma nam ju ngan ma she tin de tin su se ro de zo 다들은 도로와 다든지네 잠바 공주셔도 다와다 trendy 잠바세 니용거로 어제인데 념차소나 아니 념차도 그 영어 잠바 제도 개차르도 소소 파마나시 네마체요레섬 다든네 네네 다와다 trendy 잠바 공부도와 되니까 소리 잠베 실련 버셔데 아니 되는 얘기 공부하래 탐제 영어도 통교하도 예도 뭐 지바래 나완도 통교하라 나 맨드서니 잠바 용마로 콘도 용거라 대소도 거 전에 잠베 실련 버셔네 따니지 공연 거쳐 그래서 그거라 디소소 니지 공부 간데 공부를 지다 감숨기 심제 탐제 심제 간데 지내로 코코 땡게 심제 간데 지내 닝지 세데 인지 무지 닝지 공견데 토아데 공세데 마데 텐데 삼규하마데 남중하수 텐데 스코데도 코코레다 녀무바와 샤와도 주네 코코 땡게 창마서 그바 연게 껴데부터 연게 창마 껴데다 매나서 그바단 제나 섬자와들 세워라 어때도 코 감수 코 땡게 심제데도 창마 아니 동해지 동해 유래 동해 개반도지 동해 숨찌르기 아니 코알 코데도 삼타 소소되게 삼자 생계도 상마시거라 어디서 상마 탐제제 동해 유래 동해 개반도지 동해를 쏘고 나네 아니 코알 코데도 삼차 차로와 근데 다 지단이지 공주세 다 대체를 소소 전이지 공주세도 다 냐월이나 간데도 상 게르게 냐도 동해 간데 찬열 간데 요래 사와서와 매 책받아 인데서 책받아 도와서라 사와서와 찬열이야 사회 동해서라 사와 럽사서라 다 근데 진에 타나야 진에 대고 한데 섬탄 거라 사와 럽사서 난메세다 소복한가야 매 반듯한데 심하던 소anya dengan orang Arab miule yongdo metatan cikgu mamu yongdo sawarap sasa narmes tunjum sengera ciksu sama rurusan ma rirap tende suyonje jomyate soa tunjum tingna se tikepje se tuje tende yang su se yang koran jing nyawana le jare jare ti tujare doa 단대 통해 야대야 고라도 징리 지고라 경험에 내고 징고서를 질lep체 아니 야 개도 그래 백한가 봐서 개도 그래 드니야 개는 양수 버 조제수 야야수 담방부시 그래 야 동네 마셔네 가르스 저 남지시라 어디 마셔 다 양수 봐 다든다 냐월이야 색배 동해로 아니 캬네 객시태에도 소부 캬바 전에 남장무싱아 좀 미래 여러 봐 냐와 찬다와 미래 여샤래 매치게 도와 착바 잡니 착시탱게 요라 근데 삼르탄 동해난 게 심제도 삼르탄 게 와래 냐와세네 이다리아 칼라사주메 신종게 요다 미롱바 요라 세산 매버텐데세 아니 세처가도 지라도시도 신다가 지라시야 가네 사마주에네 텐데시라 그것이래 이다르바 제베 통에 똑베 통에 에르스로 캄부차에다 어텐데 칼라라지리 제사이레 저기도 신다 파카데 야지지라두저 사나마 사마도 메벌메도 텐데 이게 공부하다 이다신 던도당에서 메통에서 저줄에 삼로 땅고라 이용고도 니마 딱바르시 던도래 따쇼 송고도 뭐물로도 이리신도 던도도 때네 냐오이다 도저 가서 통에 단대 요 말도 다 던도도 통에 요도 냐오이다 찬도 요로 미롱벌이게 세트노게 택시 땡게 도저 통에도 콤네데 요라 어디 던도동에 던도다야 따오자 스타시도 따스 때문에 쓰고 말아 건조 통에 간데도 삼 단대 통에 된데 냐도 생활에서 나와서 말아 오늘 남주 삼을 땅게 지니 틴데지 통수는 남사 자와기라 아그다고 틴데시 대고 요래 삼타다래 냐이다 돈을 맞게 야보되데 틴데실 켄다고지 미칼라르시 카네라요 삼태데마도 카타야데 틴데케면도 다테수라 아우즈레 라다 룰레 소바타도 지네 찌글리 찌사에 동에도 아주 미경우숨 토데도 대저 삼고요다 아주 남주 티베타도 때문에 수라시 저거도 데데요 말도 아와 다텐데 통에 요거도 삼사 서고요도 던도다졌다 어째 던도 통에도 삼을다 대줄리 미세테 대전에서 통에 자 공부하라 아니 메라야고 소소카니나 잠면저 마보요도 파마 정벌 서버 사사 정벌 서버 나와라 서버 나선 잠면저 대주간가 삼을다니 니지 검시거라 그도 통에 가려네 텔 니지 검고요도 밀이야 소소 삼바나시 마두야 더바자데 마니바다 맨도바 토도 바벌 서버 도바다 자와서를 마보요라 인간 중에 숨 통도와 대저레레레 소소 간이 도절 통에 가르쳐네 대저야 삼을다 아까 삼 통에 텐데 정서 가다사 자와 검고요도 미동에서 다 할아연 돌아리 주인의 주주야 동에서 단대 동에 매번이나고 야 시골에 삼시 자두장 고께서야 하고도 하듯이 진짜 동에서 아무다 여에다 돈도 하죠 다한테는 하이나는 돌아 멤버들 삼대 송미 하듯이나 tanda tunge ke yo marda ko lenyo je shawa cherawa tingi je gom ni tanda ko tende chil ke de wara tunge soa jawa da tunge ke yo mare tang yom de ste che ke wara taina tingi adura o chiso chaban du ji tunge se de na ke wara so so le rawa me ba che nyamo ke wang ke le sa ne de wang ke ni tingi je kom ne ko jawa yang bu sto gu sam kom se te ne tanda samden ke la da sung mi la du ke wara taina ko keji ji ya le shanda chi che ne ma sa yung me to tak bar ste ma to nya wa da tan ru yang ki ko o to re tunge sam ba se do ti zo ke sam bu do nga zo nam ju ti ke sam gu ma to o tende sam tene chi da ne sim je tham je tom jam ne ro wa da kam su sim je tham je nyamo go shang do chu ne le ke wa da me ke wa sa ne tan ru la da me le ke na tunge nya ju nya ga du sam sim je tham je ko e tunge le tra na sam ando sam ta de do nga na zo me da sim ba de sa de sim je kha she bu ra de yo je de me na chom gu do ko ka de tong gu ne yi do re to je chom gu ra ti na shi re song gu ra kam sum bu de ko me ba wa na shi ge tong e ran shi chen re ta na nga ran zo de wa re so je chi le sa bu da chi sa je ya ti na ma chom do na shi ra o ti na shi ti ni tong e sam ku re song gu do o ti de re jing an zo rob ji ching so o ta mang da shi gong da yeah
So here, then, when we have created this sort of equal ground, again, it's like we're leveling a field to be able to plant the seed of compassion. And here, the second stage is sort of developing or watering this ground with the water of loving kindness. So again, we can talk about loving kindness in the sense of the sevenfold cause and effect method of recognizing all sentient beings as having been your mother and so forth. That sort of affection that we feel for them in the development of that kind of bodhicitta, where we're thinking about sentient beings and seeing them as like pleasant, as something that we feel a sort of closeness to. And then we can get into the kind of love wherein there's that desire that they have happiness. So we should just recognize that there are these two sort of different types of love here. And we begin with this kind of loving kindness of feeling close to them, which is necessary for then having that desire that they have happiness and having the desire that they be freed from suffering, which are the attitudes of compassion and love. And so we begin by thinking about the kinds of sufferings of cyclic existence, thinking about this sort of as a whole, as a general kind of a thing. And again, when we are meditating on compassion, it's not as though you're doing so from a sort of higher up place looking down on others who are suffering, sort of having this almost sort of pity for beings that are suffering. But rather, we should have this kind of compassion that is in recognition that we are all under the control of karma and the afflictions. All of those beings that are cycling within cyclic existence are afflicted by at least one of these three types of dukkha or suffering. And in this way, we should recognize that they're all subject to the sufferings of samsara. So there's sort of a general meditation on suffering, and then beginning by looking at all of the various sort of individual sufferings, looking at the various sufferings of hell beings in the ways that they have to suffer in terrible kinds of heat, in these unrelenting sort of situations where maybe they are being crushed between buildings, or maybe they are subject to being like cut into pieces, or there are various hells where those that are sort of wanting to fight it out will have to fight with each other, and then it seems like they've died, but they're actually revived and will fight again. And so there are all kinds of sufferings that one can endure in the various hell realms. Again, these are not things that we have direct sort of vision to, but we can see the types of suffering that are endured sort of in different forms within our human realm. And so there are like as well the cold kind of hells where one is subject to these freezing conditions and terrible painful kinds of suffering from that cold. And so in this way we can can go through the various types of sufferings, thinking about hungry ghosts, thinking about the kind of starvation that they endure, this constant sort of searching for food, and maybe say they're able to find food, but they can't actually swallow it or ingest it. There's some sort of obstacle to their being able to nourish themselves. So this is the kind of suffering that type of being experiences. But we can also see, again, there are humans that experience famine, that experience dying from starvation. And so then we go to the animal realm. And when we look at the kind of sufferings of animals, actually Nagarjuna said that we should really look at the animals, and not sort of like we're watching a movie, but really in a way that gets at the suffering that they are experiencing, that recognizes, if I were to take rebirth in that existence, this is the kind of suffering that we would go through. And so we can reflect on the kinds of sufferings. I mean, even if one is born as like a dog or a goat or a sheep, I mean, having to be slaughtered and all of the kinds of, even if they're not, say, in the wild where they're eating one another, there's all sorts of suffering that animals experience. And so we should really look at them. We should be aware of that, not just in like, oh, I'm watching this sort of movie of something happening out there, but really connecting with that suffering. And then we get to humans that are subject to birth, aging, sickness, death, the kinds of losses that we have to experience, having to meet with bad conditions, not being able to get what we want. And so there's this kind of sense of connecting with that experience of suffering to really elicit the feeling of, may they be freed from that. How wonderful it would be if they could be freed from this kind of suffering. And so then we get up to the sort of God realm, where they're not experiencing the sort of dukkha of abject suffering, but they experience the kind of momentary change that when they meet their time of death, they're going to have to fall into a lower realm. And so too with the sort of beings that have taken birth in the meditative concentrations or the formless realms. Although they're not subject to this sort of the suffering of dukkha, or the sort of the dukkha of suffering, or the dukkha of change, they still have that pervasive suffering of conditioned existence. So even those that are in these high meditative concentrations are subject to being momentary, changing moment to moment. And when the karma that led to that rebirth is expired, they're going to fall into lower realms. And so it's really important that we reflect on this in a way that elicits a kind of feeling, elicits this understanding that all of us, so long as we are under the control of our afflictive emotions and karma, are going to be subject to all of these types of sufferings. And this is the kind of like genuine wish that we be freed from these sufferings that we need to elicit. Because most of the time we don't think of these as suffering. It's like we're a sort of moth drawn to a flame. It's like we're jumping directly into that flame, thinking that it's happiness, thinking that we're getting something good, because we don't actually recognize that as being in the nature of suffering.
Oh yeah, that don't know. Things in the doctor rooms, yes, they could come to around the Ninji conversation with one. And things in the diabetes, I'm going to put a Ninji symbol samultan, so still samultan. And some jet to me now the samluta. Let to it and train a chimarum, some lot changiora, the neck of the songuara, Tingazilan do Yara, to the Ninja Conguor, Chamba com Chawa com Chanju, some carcom, the society, some tangiora. That in the pan rose on the children and rose on us of Cholam Tamjet around the two lebecheguara. Aranjun Nambu, some tandu, the Baran condition, so chibutete. Some jet tamjet the water, the way to the Tonga to Chesacha. Rosana Nambira Chibara, can you do something? She initiated Nambu the Chibara, Mother Pick a leg, Medwatike, Mavera. The cold leverage was what to do. Don't do it, Tonganya, and meet Tonganya, get into Na, Tonga the trainer, something. The auto was a yarage and Namsa Chis, do a cote, so we would do, Benjo Yabudo, Alco, Namupusun, so what Yabudo, some such Chesu, the other tended a Kawacom Gora. Tungatil Tunga tended a social content, the Robert and the Church of Gora. Till to do Levachora. Not to Maris, to tending Tango, looked to attended in the tendencies. When I began to do the chair, the mother tower to stay Mara. Garazo Samultan, Pleasure Launch, Church, teacher, late and the tender embassy. Tangone, bigger letters to do Levachora. Oh, tea into Zango, Jolam Tamjet when I wrote the essay. Chambada, Nijita, Zawada, Tanyum Sangadangara, Chizona, Droya Capsu Lepchagora. The Lo Changé, Tandalian, Society, Samutans, Lo Changara, subject Jaguara. Subject Janitizona, Ledus and the Lepchagora. Tiche Malemnani, Srap and Documatora, or Tiboton and Drosasma, the Ninja Congress, Ninja Comjuduma Panches Sungudua. Oh, yeah. I didn't lost it.
So here we then get up to this point where it says that we should meditate on compassion, whether we are engaged in one-pointed meditation or pursuing your ordinary activities. Meditate on compassion at all times. So this is sort of talking about how in the context of, say, sitting on our cushion, doing a formal kind of meditation practice, we develop these attitudes of compassion and love and bodhicitta and so forth through thinking through these various sufferings, through reasoning through these various topics in order to really elicit a kind of feeling, to get some sort of progress, to train our mind from that kind of meditation. But we should then, when we get up off the cushion, we should keep that in mind. It should have some sort of an impact. It should arrive in our everyday activities. It shouldn't sort of be like as if we are just sort of thinking about it on the cushion, but we don't actually have that kind of sense when we're out in the world. Like when somebody has something good happen to them, or we really have a feeling about that person, we think, oh, it would be so great if they could be freed from this suffering or really get this thing. We should have that kind of attitude toward all beings at all times. That's what we're trying to do by training our minds. So it's like when you study something in school, it's not just that you are able to learn it so you can use it in school. It's to be able to learn it outside, or to be able to use it outside of that context. And so too it is when we are sitting working with our minds. We're working with our minds and developing those attitudes in order to be able to take that out into the world, into our practice. So that's the real point of this, is that it's not just doing it to be able to do it on the cushion, but to be able to have this at all times in our life. So then we will pick up on the sort of stages of how we go about meditating on compassion.
Oh, yeah. I'm going to dream to my Sabbath ba. Oh, Ninji Tingy Jelan, Dugan, Ronchelam, Tamjet, Rondi, two Tamjet, Simjan Tamjela, Gombar Shaws, and Ninji Comgores, or Ra. How come you can do this? The Ninji Comjugi, the body shagdoa. Dinner my Ninji Comjugi, Kabar Shagor, Kurum Panch, Tambu, Disam, Totin, Disam, Shagora. Toma Konar Zashiki, Chonam La Chige, maybe, Tungenam Yamson Yoa, Yamson Yoa Toya Combacha, Tambudelia. Ninji to the Tambu Sosu Casanya Setineke de Lela Yora. Tavitanum in a Chita miniature to teach any Lela Dua, Tinich to Indicate in a Tracom Gudua. Can Ninji the computer Thomas Sosu Nami, Kani Ingila Sobota, Pamela Sobota, Sosu Sendel Cabo, Cheva Yona, no dinner since Pasam Tangora, Thomas in a Samuta. Tatina Simja Kanga Koran Zungune, $1 Tungam in the Chiba Rangune, Sendisam de Matu Kawanga Malia, Tenan Chiba Chiba, some Taki Kondo Sheba, some to Slep Gura. The Toma Konan Zashi Chonamla, a Chige Mebe, Tungen Naso, Yamson Yoma, Combacha Ose, Sosu Zashi Cholia. That means in me, Tungi Sosu Kabunya Kanga, Tamadu Mambu Yono. Pamam Debala Sobata, Roba Debala Soba, Pudula Sotungi, Chita Mabunya, or the Nasala Soba, or Tezuko Samuta. Take it some Bani, Tungi, 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 Kabanduchi, Tungi, Soba Nasu, Samutan, Tambudin Zashi, Kichone, Kasanya Setine, Gotu Sungudua. Toma Konan Zashi, Kichonam La Chige, maybe so Kondo Shebe, Tungi Nazo Yamson Yoma Combarcha Ose. Oh, Tene, Simje. Nyamba Niji City, Chelia, Tene Simje, Nyamba Niji Chida Mebartones, Simje Tamje, Sosu Chedi, Nyandegi Chot and Sumbarwa, Rana Yabuchebata, Rani Yabu Yabata, Kyoangamanamsus, Tanganzun de Chuna, sometimes to send it, and sometimes you mera, Kyoangama the Chimakanga, the Dul Samtangura. Joangama the Chime, the do sometimes to send it Cotundure, use some Jeremato, Zodrera, Shema Yonju de Keshara, Songsara de Tozu Samo Susu Tidul Sikuyora, Nama Yakucheva de Yakutan Javistan Tankore, Tandar Yakucheva Yenada, or teacher Mamba Yonju to the Sosu Tidul Sigura, Arazo Sochendi Janja Sosu Tidu Yonia de Chimato, Chimapanja Samu Madana, and it shows some Yongo Mato. Show some Tandizako Samba Kora Jachambuskuyora. Luchebun do Semda, Java the Sosu Chinne Chin, you do steady in Samatana, and Yaga the door the Karina to you or Sanjay Kovan Toga Chagin, Kale Yagin, some like to you or no. Or this Samadani, Kakati, and good mother, Chendi Kanya, Samadan, they took a maybe some rich corridor, or did get somebody to you there. So the Kachambo Samata. Talk about them, but the married and you can you could say, Tandiso. Tenesimje. Tene Simja Yambani Chitra Mebaras, Simja Tamja, Etsendi Raganya de Yamba Yakujeva Yambani, Samachibarism, Keva Mebani, Tone, Chitra Mebatone, Simja Tamja, Tag and Yandu Jurba, Kona or Yamdus, Simja Tamja, Sendi Pamala Sobani, do Jurbanashi, Tamja Jawangamanam, Guru Resam. Nyendu Juba Konare Mato, Nyendu Jurmanu, Sani Omar, Tanda Kijin, Washington Omardo, Tangi Omardo, Tamba in a ranch, Mangarazna, the Miliki, the Mambo, the Miliki to do Pamanya de Karachi, Tanda Wara Shayana, Tennis Kashe Kashe, Susi, Chit by Kid of Tindili, your cigar, or dear Lutucci or the Tati, Yabuti Temas Water. Shadi Puina, Mogi Puina, Chicha. Trongbani do Trongbani Lapsan to each other. Trongbani, Trongbachi to the Pajo de Tanya Chamgamedua, Kabumedua. Any Suja Trongba de Baba Amache, Puche, Puli Namache, Yodoa. Any Condulia Nyaso Sagi, the Chambuchi Stingy water, Tina Yamambosa Shagara. Any Papa de Nimani, Kalasara and Saint Yade de Simje, and the Kalas Chigora. Oh, this is any Pajo de Tromba de Condu Chambo Yomar, Pajo de Baba Amache, Puchiche, Pudi Kimechi Ora. Oh, tea didn't Pudi Suja de Liang, put the Sazani Ora, tea Pudi Suja Kime, Pomodele Chagba Chagiora, Kabuyong Ora, and get the Condu Kamar de Pajo de Tene Chemako Pamani de Trondora. Sujo Pamani de Tondo, Papa de Tromne, Tronde Coti, Yamabosesa, Kora Nyalike de Ore, Papa de Nyalike Sora. And Ama de Tondo, the Ama de Nande Shenjaro Chetaco, Tondulike, Kilikedera. And the Pajogi Magbadi, trying game Magbadi Shine Codi, Consulti Magba Pomu Pulikere, Pure de Ore. And I could put the Skora Pug to Sunyagra, Sashambusigra, Panganya there, and I could Shasagar and Yashasavati, Papa, Tondonati, Yadi Nimati Kadukese, Sadeva Kadukere. And a kid which is tolerant of the Paju Sigara, Amate or Yakama. And it is in this scene, when she is in our Pasha Sashi Malatase, Papa Shasavira. Amal Tambuja Paju Sigora, Magasa Tradiku Pangarnya, Sachimbusigora, Busigora, Koyachula Kembutose, Koyachulita, Gertrude, Nimbukamedu Tindiri Snoro, Tinashing and Jubu or no. Oh, this is good now. That's my understanding.
So then it goes into the kind of stages, the steps of meditating on compassion. And so it says here, begin by meditating on your friends and relatives. So here we begin, it gives sort of a more extensive explanation of how we actually go about doing the meditation on compassion. And we begin by thinking about our relatives, our friends, those that we feel close to. So as opposed to the sort of equanimity where we began with a neutral person, person and then move to our those that we're close to and then our enemies. Here we begin by really thinking about those that we feel close to, because it's easier for us to generate this wish that they be freed from suffering. So when we look at those that are dear to us, our mother, our father, our relatives, our friends, our children, and we think that they are subject to these three types of dukkha, these three types of suffering, we recognize that we wish them to be freed from that, from having this sort of closeness with them. But we expand by recognizing too that although they have been sort of helpful to us in this life, we have considered them to be good to us in this life, we're really not just thinking about this life. When we begin to talk about Dharma, it immediately extends beyond just this life. Because really in this sort of scheme of things, this life is just a moment. It's a very short period of time. And we should really be thinking about our experiences beyond just this life, thinking about future happiness and future suffering. And this kind of thought that comes is when we are talking about Dharma and engaging in Dharma, it's really important to have this kind of wide-ranging or sort of long-term thinking that our mental continuum is going to continue on, although we are going to give up this body. The sort of things that we experience in this body are very temporary. And thinking just about sort of the good things for this is thinking very short term. We need to think longer term than that. And when we begin to think beyond just this life, we recognize that all beings that we encounter have at some point acted with the kind of closeness and love that those close relatives have shown us in this life. And so it's other than not recognizing or not remembering, recalling the kindness of those beings, we can't say that they haven't acted in that capacity. So again, there's the famous sort of story, whether it was Shariputra or Malgadhyayana, there's a story that's sort of summarized in a verse, which talks about there were these two kind of towns where there was a great dislike between them. We had these two families, and there was one family with a father who was a fisherman, and so he had like a pond in his yard, and he would continually catch fish from this pond, and he had a son with a wife. And there's another family that was very sort of their enemies, and there was kind of a secret liaison between the wife of that family and the husband of the other family. And so time goes on, and the mother and father of this family have passed away, as well as actually the sort of enemy family has passed away. And so they're looking on this scene, and the Buddha is able to see the previous lives of these various characters. So in this family, they're still sort of continuing to catch fish out of this pond and eat them. And the father, who had caught so many fish out of that pond, he was reborn as a fish within that pond. And the mother who had died, she was reborn out of her attachment to this household. She was reborn as the family dog. And then this woman has had her baby, and it turns out that this enemy that they had was reborn as this human child. And so observing the scene, they say, well, you're eating your father's flesh and beating your mother while you coddle your enemy in your lap. Isn't samsara funny? Like, isn't it sort of ridiculous the way that our relationships change? So in this scene, it's encapsulated the way in which our relationships are not certain, are not determined, but rather we're continuously sort of flowing through different relationships with beings, and we should recall that they have all acted in the capacity as our dear loved ones.
Oh yeah, oh dear. Oh yeah, that tambun zashi gwa so kaso sinyasa to 동해 내주 삼았다는 때다 전적이 인지 검으로 되네 대체리야 동해 나저가 냠선요와 동해 검버쳐 토만 자식이 추남라 지게 매베 동해 나저 냠선요와 동해 검버쳐 오세라 인지 검부래서 되네 심제 냠반 얘기해서 되네 심제 현다 상마데 랑가 자식의 총바 제자 매바 개발 매바 통내서 심지어 탐제니 다게 년도 줘봐 코나오 냠도 용서 삼신 파르메 소남라 컴퓨터네 파르메 심지어도 란단 저와 맹게 남유 가보다 자다 년다 근데 그게 저와 맹게 파르메 심지어도 컴고래서 so tene nyamba nye ki chita me ba thone ase simje tamje ne ta ge nyen du ba khona so parme simje te zo jawa ngama nam so ta ge nyen du ma juro me sam kabunye borwa phama nyen de la so ba ma jo me sam ne ta ge nyen du ba khona o sa nyen du ba jang jang yin sam ki chi phone ngoma sim ba sam ma do jawa ka du yin ko phama la so ba nyen de ta chi ka se nye sa juro she ji yin sam gore nyen du ba khona o nyam do yo so samshin parme chola komba chaos parma to solia si so nyen de ta chikba chungba so ta na namju ne ngan so so na ndo se na ndo na ma do se na ma do che do ro wa tinde member se ko sama na ndo ro so ra pa ta ju ne ko tra yin samsa ta ta du se ra ta ro tinde member so go yor da simje tamje ta ga nyen du jo ba ko na o so so nyen du ma ju ba che ja me pa ma nyen ni do le so ba ma ju ba me sa yon so samshin se parme cho nam la kombato parme simje to rang chen de ta nye sa ke simje ta nyam ba kombore se kang ge telan za she ge cho shin do ning ji te nyam bar shu ba te se parme simje to so so za she na shin ge ta ta chi ba re je chong so na se go ra o shu ba ju ba te je cho ju simje tamje la kombato ne cho ju simje tamje la pa kombore 강게 세세 단디네 닝지 디시라 가서 닝지 공배 남바스 닝지 첨부 깨베 세디시거도아 강게 세 부총우스 아마치르 부총중제 배 신도 배 자첨부 세수여 버세 강게 세 부총우 닝도 똑바스 배 닝네 배 가부여세지 대동에 시부제 배 나네 대요나 동행와 교배 마신도 마데네 부두 동행에 때나 섬제 저 숙치중 숙첨부 깨거라 어디 저제 심제 탐절이야 찍바찍이 돈에 동에데 텐도 네 닝지 첨부세데 토바레세 근데 넘버 체인지 저지 계속나 저 닝지 첨부세 그래서 저 닝지 첨부 명 토바레소라 강게서 동에와 주에 마신도 당이 신도 동에와 덤베 넘버 강게 주가 대체 심제 탐절에 심냠버 두르바이 대체 쪽바세서 닝지 첨부 연대 쪽바레스 모네데 깨가레스 닝지 첨부 명야 토보스 어디 봐도 지구나 샤샤 보자.
So here then we begin this meditation on compassion by thinking about those beings that we are close to. So we again begin by meditating on your friends and relatives. Recognize how they experience the various sufferings that have been explained. So again, we think about the kind of suffering that they are experiencing and elicit this thought of may they be freed from that suffering, that attitude of wishing to free them. And then, having seen all sentient beings as equal with no difference between them, you should meditate on sentient beings to whom you feel neutral. So those that are neutral, that we don't really have any kind of relationship with in this life, we should recognize that they're all equal toward us in terms of the kindness that they have shown us in previous lives, that all beings, even those that we don't feel a relationship with in this life, have acted in this way, showing love and compassion in the past. And so because of that, we shouldn't view them as differently than we view our those that we determine as being close to us in this life. And so when the compassion you feel towards them is the same as the compassion you feel toward your friends and relatives, meditate on compassion for all sentient beings throughout the 10 directions of the universe. So when you are able to then be able to feel this kind of compassion toward all sentient beings without any kind of distinction between them, we should then extend that out toward others. Now, usually when we encounter beings, we're immediately kind of labeling them, thinking about like, oh, that's my enemy, or oh, this is someone that I feel close to. But if we are instead able to have this kind of feeling toward them, that they are in which we recognize their sort of suffering situation, and also recognize that see them as having acted kindly toward us, then we are able to have this similar wish, this thought that they be freed from their sufferings in a kind of equal way. And so then the measure of having generated this compassion is then in the next section where it says, Just as a mother responds to her small, beloved, and suffering child, when you develop a spontaneous and equal sense of compassion toward all sentient beings, you have perfected the practice of compassion. And this is known as great compassion. So when we have that kind of feeling of closeness, of wishing to free sentient beings from their sufferings in the way that a mother would want to free a suffering child from their suffering, that kind of feeling equally toward all sentient beings, that sort of aspect of mind toward all, is the measure of having generated this attitude of great compassion. So that's where we will stop then for today.
I think so. I think so.